Hi, this is Paula. Today I'll be making a banner and I'd like to bring you along and show you what I did. This is an Easter banner and I started with some lightweight chipboard. And my lightweight chipboard is, cereal boxes and things of that nature. And then I just cut my chipboard so that it was nice and square. I needed to have good straight edges. And then I took my T-square and I went along and I made a few tick marks at the 7-inch mark so that my flags would be 7 inches in length. I played around with the size of my flags and decided that I wanted them to be 5 inches across at the top and 7 inches long. So once I went ahead and made my tick marks where my 7-inch mark was, I went ahead, lined up my ruler, and marked that off. Then I came in from the corner here and I marked off 5 inches because I wanted the top of my banner to be 5 inches. And then at the bottom down here, I came in 2.5 inches so that I could get the correct measurements to make my flag. To cut this, you could use a craft knife and a ruler on top of a cutting surface, piece of glass or a self-healing mat, or you could use a paper cutter. The papers I've chose to use for this banner are this 6-inch paper pad from Our Daily Bread called the Shabby Rose Collection, and these papers are just gorgeous. It's really, really pretty papers. Here's a sample of a couple of them. Now that my triangle's cut out, I've taken my two-way glue and applied that across the surface. And then I'm just going to put my paper down on there. I'm going to set it up on the edge. Make sure it's nice and straight across the top there too. And I'm just going to put that down. Now, I don't like to cut the paper right away when it's damp because you won't get a good clean cut. So all I do is cut off a piece so that I can piece the front. Make sure my glue's on there good. And then I piece that bottom inch, since my paper is just 6 inches long. And that's not going to show later, it'll get covered up anyway. You can also use a brayer if you like. Then I let that dry, and then I come back and I trim that. Okay, now that my glue's had time to set up and dry, I'm just going to take my craft knife, come in here and trim off the excess paper. Now if you have an electronic cutter, you can also set up your electronic cutter to do your cutting of your triangles also. Okay, you really can't tell that's pieced, plus we're going to cover that later anyway. So we have the front on there. Okay, the next step is to go ahead and put the border at the top. And I've used one of the Beautiful Borders dies from Our Daily Bread. And I like to use a two-way pin for that also. And the reason for that is if you get this glue in an area where you didn't want it, you can use an eraser and get the glue up. And then I just center that across the top. The other reason I like using this type of glue is that you have a few minutes of open time to work with it, and if something's not quite right, you can slide it around just a little bit if you need to. Okay, then I'm going to get this ready. I'm actually going to tuck these little tabs over and glue those down. Once I have these tabs glued down, then I can go ahead and put some paper on the back to finish the project. I like to have a finished back. Alright, to finish off the back, I'm going to use my two-way glue. And my paper that I'm using, my cardstock, is a standard 110-pound white cardstock. Now, zip dry is another glue I like to use for this type of a project, because you can also use an eraser to remove anything that might get onto an area you didn't intend for it to be. It's easy to remove it. So I'm just going to plop this down. Okay, now that this has had time to set up and the glue has dried, I'm going to come in here and trim this. If you don't let your glue set up and dry real well, when you make these cuts, if the paper is damp, you can get some fraying or even some tearing. So it's always good to wait. Turning my knife around because I didn't want to cut the edge of this paper, where the border is attached there. Okay, now that I have everything trimmed up on there, I can go ahead and make my holes. On each corner, I'm using a white eyelet. It's a 1/4 inch. And I'm taking the smallest hole, which I think is about 1/8 of an inch, on my crocodile. Yeah, this is 1/8 of an inch. And I've taken my gauge and I've pushed it all the way forward as far as I can get that. Then I'm going to come right along here to the edge. And I want to make sure that I'm punching down through the front. And I'm going to line that up right on the edge. So there are my holes. Then I'm going to attach my eyelets. And I just have everything set on my punch for the smallest setting, since these are tiny eyelets. Okay, now those are attached and that looks good. So I can come in with my pearls and attach those at the top if I want to right now. And the adhesive on the pearls isn't always as strong as I would like it to be. So I usually take some glossy accents and place a little dot right where I want my pearl to go. And these pearls that I'm using are attached, so I'm going to have to trim these to get them apart. Now I find it, if you like to use a lot of rhinestones and bling on your projects, I find that you have a nice sharp piercing tool, that it comes in really handy to place those pearls exactly where you want them. So I'll go ahead and attach the rest of these pearls. Okay, while I wait for my glue gun to get hot, I'm going to be putting the trim on, but I've got to wait for my glue gun to get hot again. And my pearls are still setting up. There are some other components that need to be made. And I took a corsage pin and added some glass pearl beads to that. And I used glossy accents to glue these on. So I made those all in advance. That's this tip here. So I've got those all ready to go. And then I've made little S-hooks out of aluminum wire. And I'll show you what I did for those. Oh, and for the end of the corsage pin, I cut the tip off with a good pair of wire cutters. And I like to use wire cutters that are called linesman's pliers. You can find them easily for about $15, I believe. And these are just heavier wire cutters. And this is kind of, you know, it's a steel pin that's kind of hard to cut. And so I like these. It's easier on my hands. And these are the type of pliers that an electrician would use. So I just went to the jewelry department at the craft store and I picked up some aluminum wire. The packaging doesn't even say what gauge it is. And it's pretty thin and flimsy. Bends really easy because it's aluminum. Got kind of a tip on there, so I want to get a nice clean cut. So what I do is I take my round nose pliers, and you can find these in the jewelry department of the craft store too. And I'm going to make an S, and I'm going to start at the large end because I want a nice big enough circle. And you don't want to press very hard because you'll make dents in the metal. But I want to make sure that that very tip that I catch it and pull that around. So now I have this. So I have that curve. Then I'm going to leave my pliers in that hole, and then I'm going to start to fold it back over on the other side so that I start to get my S shape. Then I'm going to bring that all the way back around to finish that. Okay, now to make this cut, I use my jewelry pliers, little snips, and I get a nice little S-hook. And that's what I've used to attach my triangles together for my banner. So I make those all up in advance. And then I make my bows up. And I decided to go with a bow that has 6 loops total. And there's lots of videos on how to make a bow, and all I did was take a drill bit and drill every 1/2 inch on a piece of wood that's 3/4 of an inch thick. Then I took a pair of chopsticks and cut off pieces, and then I decided how large I wanted my bow to be, and then I went ahead and made my bow. And you can look that up easily to see how to make those. So I have all my bows made up. And then I needed to cut my little discs and my scallop circles. So the scallop circle is a die from Our Daily Bread Recipe and Tags die set. And then my circle I cut using the Our Daily Bread Matting Circles die, and this is the smallest circle from that die set. Then once I had all those cut out, and I cut my circles, well, I took the lace pattern and this kind of a honeycomb pattern paper to make my scallop circles. And then my plain circles that I've used to back my scallop with, I've cut those out of the pink gingham. There's a pink dot. Let's see. And then the rose paper also. And I just alternated those along my banner. So that one was made with the gingham. This was made with the rose paper underneath. This one's the pink dot. And then I took chipboard letters and I glued those down. And I glued them down so that I had the back of my paper facing me, glued the letters down so they were backwards. So I get those on the right side. And then I took my craft knife and I just cut those out of the paper. And I was able to get all of my letters that I needed onto one 6-inch piece of paper. The next thing that I did is I took some sandpaper and a sanding block and I started to smooth out my edges so that it cleans it up nicely and gets rid of any little jagged parts. And then I take a little tiny piece of sandpaper. I just wrap around my finger to get these curved parts. And once I'm happy with all of that, then I went ahead and I started sponging. Now on my scallop circles, I sponged some aqua ink on the edge of that. Then I've just used some pink, and I went ahead and sponged all along my edge of my letters. So you can see where I've sponged here and then also on my letters. Then I'm going to take my pearl pen and put a little hot glue on there. And I've got a good 1/2 inch left on the end of that pen. I just glue that to the tip. Then I took my rose and pearl ribbon and I add just a little small amount of glue right along the very edge, like this. And I glue this down, and I glue it down so that half of it's actually on the edge of my paper and then half of it is hanging off the edge. Then I decide kind of how the tip is going to come out. Sometimes I have to work with it for a minute or so to get it to go just the way I want. I come back in there and make sure I cover up the tip of that pen. Then I need to leave room so that my eyelet, I can get to that and work with that. Then I have to decide exactly where I'm going to trim that off at. I'm going to push that up there. That's a little frayed, so I'm going to trim this. So now my base is done, except for attaching my bow. So I'm going to go and finish sponging my letter. I'm going to attach these two letters together, and just as if you were working with a piece of jewelry and a jump ring, going to give that a half twist to open up that loop. Okay, I've got that on there and all closed up, looking nice. Got one more to go on the end. And my S-hooks that I made, these are really like a closed S-hook. Okay, so that's on there. And then on the ends I add an extra S-hook so that the banner lays the right way, nice and flat against the wall once it's hanging. And in the very last loop, I'm going to take my ribbon, push it through there, and this ribbon is 5/8 of an inch, and I basically fold it in half on there, and then I knot it to keep it on. Now I have my disc ready to go on here, and you can see the dimension there as I've used the foam tape. And I kind of lay that on about where I think it needs to go. Then I'm leaving about 1 inch from the base of the lace border at the top to the top of my circle. It's going to be right about there. Okay, I got my ribbon tied on here on the end. And I'm just going to finish up and take my paper rose. These were white and I tinted them to go with the papers, but you can buy them already colored. I'm going to glue that onto the center of my bow. Let that set for a minute. Then I'm going to take my other bow that I have up here that I've made for the end to hide my knot there. A little bit of glue. I'm basically gluing that right on the knot. Now that's had a minute to set up. I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the back of my bow. And I put this on, I don't put it at the very tip. I put it up enough that it hides the seam. I basically glue it right over that seam. That last 1 inch of paper that we glued on there. Hold that on there for a minute. Don't want to burn my fingers, so I'm going there with a pair of pliers. Make sure that's down good. Okay, and that's basically finished. So this banner actually reads Happy Easter, and it's one long banner instead of two separate banners. And to split up between the two words, I've added a pennant here, and I've taken the Cross with Vine stamp, and I stamped that onto one of the pieces of paper from the Shabby Rose collection, and I used a London Fog Gray Memento ink there. Then I lined it up on my paper cutter and cut the shape out. Then I took a pearl to put here in the center of the cross, and then I took strips of smaller pearls to put on the front of the cross there.